Good afternoon. Welcome to SCAG's Toolbox Tuesday. Today's session focuses on language access strategies and features the U.S. Department of Justice, California's Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, our very own SCAG, and the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. My name is Lindsay Nolan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with wavy brown hair wearing a peach-colored button-up shirt and a fuzzy background. I'm a senior regional planner at SCAG, and I'll be kicking off today's session before handing things over to our speakers and co-facilitator. While we introduce the session, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and say hi to each other. So, moving along. Some logistics for today. Our session will be about an hour and a half. There will be several opportunities for questions and answers. If you have a question during a presentation, we encourage you to type it in the chat or use the raise hand function in Zoom. And as always, the meeting today will be recorded, and the presentations and session recording will be posted on our website and sent to everyone who registered for the event today. I'd now like to offer a land acknowledgement. Here in the SCAG region, we're currently on occupied and unceded land of Indigenous peoples who are and have been the traditional caretakers of the land in this region. I'm calling in from Chumash and Gabrielino Tongva land. If you haven't already, I do encourage you to visit the resources shared in the chat to learn more about the land and Indigenous communities where you live. As this session is part of our equity series of Toolbox Tuesdays, I'd like to frame today's session with our equity efforts here at SCAG. So in July 2020, SCAG's Regional Council adopted a resolution affirming its commitment to advancing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion throughout Southern California. This led to the development of a working definition of racial equity and the Racial Equity Early Action Plan. The Early Action Plan includes 4 goals and 3 strategies to advance racial equity through SCAG's policy, practices, and activities. And one of the goals is to encourage racial equity in local planning practices, which is what we aim to do through these equity-focused Toolbox Tuesday sessions. So some of those are listed on this screen. You can access the previous Toolbox Tuesday sessions at the link in the chat. And so there are, as you can see, several from the last few years. So now I'd like to give the audience a chance to do some intros as well. We're going to do that through a quick poll. There are 3 poll questions, so I'll give everyone a minute to fill those out. Please just make sure to scroll down through the poll to make sure you answer all 3 questions before pressing submit. The first question is, what best describes the type of organization you're representing today? The second question is, what best describes where you are today? And the third question is, has the jurisdiction that you work for or live in implemented a language access plan? All right. I think we have probably about the audience participation. So let's end the poll and share results. Looks like we have a lot of folks from local government, some advocacy, regional and state government. Glad to have you all here. Most of everybody is calling in from the SCAG region or California, and it looks like we're kind of all over the place in terms of where folks are at with the language access plan, and a lot of people don't know. Okay. Oops, did you guys see the results? I think Jasper, did you see them?
Yeah, I saw them.
Okay, cool. And then I think I'll pass off to you.
Okay, hi guys, I'm Jasper and I'm assisting Lindsay with facilitating. So thank you guys for completing that poll. Going through our agenda now, our first presentation will be from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, followed by a presentation from the US Department of Justice, and then a presentation from our organization, SCAG, and lastly, a presentation from the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. After those, we'll have a Q&A panel, which is where your questions will be answered. Feel free to type your questions in the chat throughout the presentations, and we'll answer them during the Q&A panel. Now, I'm honored to introduce our featured guest for this session. Laureen Laglagaron is a senior attorney at the Federal Coordination and Compliance Section of the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. As a national expert in language access, her work includes enforcing, coordinating, and overseeing compliance with the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Executive Order 13166, which is improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency, and similar federal statutes and policies that prohibit discrimination. Daniel Trejo is a diversity, equity, and inclusion analyst and language access coordinator at the California Department of Housing and Community Development. As a language access coordinator, he has ensured public information is accessible to individuals with disabilities, and he is currently developing and upgrading the complaint process and quality assurance of interpreter services to ensure that the public receives the best service possible. Anna Vallianatos is a department manager of media and public affairs here at SCAG. She has been involved in communication programs with specialized audiences in the areas of public health, early childhood education, and transportation and infrastructure. She drafted the first formal language assistance plan for the Los Angeles County Metropolitan Transportation Authority in 2012 and saw it through multiple updates, as well as taking over SCAG's language assistance plan for its latest update in 2023. Last but not least, Lupita Huerta is a transportation planner and community engagement practitioner with the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. As part of the department's strategic engagement team, Lupita supports project delivery by ensuring that community engagement is culturally sensitive and accessible, limiting any barriers to participation, including language access needs. Lupita also led the rollout of the department's first bilingual glossary of transportation terms, a tool that includes over 200 transportation planning and community engagement terms that has helped standardize LADOT's Spanish language communication. With that, I'll now hand it over to Daniel to give us our first presentation. Are you ready, Daniel?
Yes, I am, and hopefully everyone is ready as well. I'm really excited to give this presentation. So give me a few moments while I'll share my screen, which I'm doing right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen since I'm having issues from my end, but give me a moment, okay? Typically, well, I'm experiencing the same issues that I had during our, hold on. My presentation isn't opening, of course. It's being stubborn, but give me a few moments while I open it.
Daniel, I'm also happy to share and give you slide control. Want to try that?
Yeah, give me a moment. There we go. I think it's working from my end again. I just had to reclose, or I just had to close the program, then reopen it. And usually that does the trick for anything. Here we go. And I'm sharing my screen once more, and hopefully that works. If not, I'll pass it over to you for you to drive the slide deck. But there we go. Perfect. That's working from my end. Again, I was just being stubborn, and all it takes is just a quick little closing out the program and restarting it, right? So thank you so much, everyone, and for allowing me to do this presentation. It's called Breaking Barriers, the Evolution and Impact of Language Access in the United States. And again, I am from the California Department of Housing and Community Development. And let me introduce myself. So my name is Daniel Trejo, or Daniel, and I'm totally fine with using either pronunciation of my name. My pronouns are él, he, and him. I use él when we're speaking in Spanish. And in case you have the visual difficulties or difficulty seeing me on your screen, I want to describe myself. I have light brown skin, black hair on my head, and black facial hair as well. And I'm currently wearing thin frame glasses, and my background is blurred. I also have a gold piece of jewelry right here. It's geometric, and I'm wearing a black shirt right now. Within the DI unit, I serve as a DI analyst and language access coordinator at the California Department of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD, and my educational background includes over 8 years of valuable experience in DEI, particularly disability advocacy, racial equity, and language access, making sure that governmental services are accessible for folks who do not speak English. So before we dive into the history of language access, let's talk a little bit about literacy. And just to give you a little bit of insight, this is the type of training that we typically do at HCD when we're introducing language access resources to the folks here in our department. And this is just a little snapshot of it that's going to get covered in about 10 minutes, okay? Typically, this is over an hour-long training, so you'll just be getting a little taster of it. But let's continue. With literacy, it is a fundamental piece of language access, and it helps us understand our role in providing governmental services and information to the public. Literacy refers to the ability to read, write, and comprehend information effectively. It involves not only basic reading and writing skills, but also the ability to understand, interpret, and critically evaluate written texts. Literacy is essential for individuals to fully participate in society, access information, communicate effectively, and engage in lifelong learning. It plays a fundamental role in education, employment, and personal development, serving as a cornerstone for social and economic empowerment. Yet roughly half of US adults aged 16 to 74 lack literacy proficiency. Now, again, to begin, I'll give you a shortened version of our language access training that we do here at HCD, covering some of the main themes, including historical context and key terms. But please keep in mind that the beginning of the section may be a bit painful, but it's essential history to understand why language access matters and why it's a legal requirement for governmental offices to be accessible to those who do not speak English proficiently. To begin, between 1776 and 1887, the United States seized over 1.5 billion acres of land from America's indigenous people throughout treaties and executive orders. And this is an interactive module developed by historian Claudio Sant at the University of Georgia, who illustrates the disappearance of blue Indian homelands and the establishment of red reservations that you see like here in little pockets here and there. This period marked for the onset of prolonged history of cultural erasure and language suppression among Native Americans and indigenous groups. And these actions laid the foundation for systemic racism in the United States, where language oppression was a key tool in the broader strategy of cultural assimilation and domination. Indigenous languages and cultures were systematically suppressed in an effort to force Native populations to adopt English and assimilate into Euro-American society. And unfortunately, systemic racism, the oppression of indigenous people and language suppression and oppression continue to persist today. We're still feeling those effects today. Many communities still face significant barriers to maintaining and revitalizing their languages, which are integral to their cultural identity and heritage. And understanding this historical context is crucial for recognizing the importance of language access in today's educational systems and governmental services. So by ensuring language access, we not only prevent cultural erasure, but we also honor and preserve the linguistic heritage of all communities. And this commitment is linguistic diversity is essential to combating the legacy of systemic racism and promoting equity in our society. I'm also going to begin with this image of Tom Torlino, a member of the Navajo Nation, which illustrates the drastic changes imposed on Indigenous children at the Carlisle School. Language as a communication method can be broken, written, or can be spoken, can be written, and gestural, involving rules like vocabulary, grammar, and semantics. It's how we facilitate interactions and express ideas, thoughts, and emotions. However, the policing and biases of language, such as accents, shape access to communication. And by understanding these and facing these historical injustices, it reminds us to why providing equitable language access today is vital to prevent the same kind of forced assimilation and cultural suppression. So let's continue and exploring the history of language and education in the US. The use of English became prevalent as a result of colonization of the Americas. From 1819 to 1970, the US federal government established and supported Indian boarding schools across the nation. And these schools aimed to assimilate Native children by forcing them to cut their hair, wear uniforms, and adopt military-like discipline. And the multitude of abuses that took place in these schools is an incredibly dark chapter in our nation's history. And this systemic attempt to erase Native languages and cultural highlights through genocide and the ongoing need for language access to protect linguistic diversity and cultural identity are very important. And almost 20 years before the closure of the last Indian boarding school, which closed in 1973, the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that racially segregating children in public schools was unconstitutional. And this decision was a catalyst for expanding civil rights movement, which included efforts to ensure equitable access to education for non-English speaking students. And then following the decision, attention shifted to providing language support, leading to the pivotal case of Lau versus Nichols of 1974, which underscored the necessity of language access and education to ensure all students receive an equal education. The Lau versus Nichols case involved the San Francisco Unified School District, which absorbed over 2,800 students of Chinese ancestry who were not proficient in English. Classes were taught exclusively in English, creating significant barriers for these students. And Lau and other students of Chinese descent who did not speak English and received no supplemental English courses brought a class action suit against the San Francisco Unified School District. And the court ruled that based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964, school districts receiving federal funds must provide non-English speaking students with instruction in the English language in the English language to ensure equal education. So the Lau versus Nichols case was a significant step forward in ensuring language access and education and reinforcing the need for legal obligations to provide language support. Understanding this case helps us recognize the legal foundations that mandate language access in our educational systems today. And again, as a reminder, classes were taught exclusively in English, so we could think about how that impacted folks' educational experience and also just experience well into adulthood, right? And at the same time, in 1973, Mervyn M. Dimely authored the Dimely-Alatorre Bilingual Services Act in California, ensuring that individuals seeking state services are not prevented from receiving services because of language barriers, which I'm sure that one of my colleagues will speak further on that after I'm done presenting. The foundational legislation for our language access responsibilities of today operates on the principle that a free and democratic society relies on the ability of all its residents to effectively communicate with the government. It mandates that state agencies with public contact employees offer equitable access to government services for all substantial language groups, not just those proficient in English. And this act continues to embody California's commitment to promoting equitable access to government services and fostering civic participation among all its diverse residents. Then The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, otherwise known as IDEA, established in 1990, ensures that children with disabilities have the right to a free, appropriate public education. And this includes language support for students with limited English proficiency who also have disabilities. IDEA ensures that language barriers do not impede the education of children with disabilities, reinforcing the importance of inclusive educational practices. And this further underscores our responsibility to provide language access to not only for those who have limited English proficiency, but also for individuals who need alternate formats to fully engage with government services and programs. Then, of course, we must mention that in the year 2000, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 13166, titled Improving Access to Services for Persons with Limited English Proficiency, requiring federal agencies and recipients of federal financial assistance to take reasonable steps to ensure meaningful access to their programs and activities by persons with limited English proficiency. This order reinforces the requirements of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and highlights the federal commitment to language access. And again, language access just doesn't mean providing translation, interpretation, or materials in large print, braille, or other formats. It also ensures that information is understandable to the general public. The Federal Plain Language Act, established in 2010, requires federal agencies to use clear communication that the public can understand and use. This act ensures that the government communications are accessible and understandable, promoting transparency and inclusivity. And similarly, the California Plain Language Act, established in 2011, requires state agencies to use plain language in their written communications, ensuring that state communications are clear and accessible. And another notable legislative achievement to ensure that the public has fair and equal access to information provided by the government also includes the Affordable Care Act, established in 2010, which includes requirements for language assistance services for LEP individuals, which again, LEP stands for Limited English Proficiency, ensuring that they have access to healthcare services and information promoting health equity. And in 2013, amendment to the Dimely Aleatory Bilingual Services Act requires state agencies to provide public notices and communications in languages spoken by a substantial number of the public served by the agency. Now, as we come to an end of our session, let's reflect on the critical importance of language access and its profound impact on our society. We've explored how landmark cases like Brown versus the Board of Education and Lau versus Nichols laid the groundwork for ensuring that no child is denied an education due to language services, and the Dimely Aleatory Bilingual Services Act and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act further reinforce our duty to provide equitable access to all. Now, I also just want everyone to reflect on this question. You don't need to come on mic or anything, but you can just drop it into the chat. Does the language you speak determine the quality of your life? And you could talk about how language impacts your life. And this includes the concepts of accents, slang, or vernacular. And I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to present this, and also want to thank my wonderful team. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was amazing. Laureen, are you ready to present?
I am. Give me one moment to share my screen as well. Great. And I think you can see this. And let me just make sure that I have this out of the way. Great. Well, good afternoon. My name is Laureen Laglagaron. I use she, her pronouns, and I have long black hair, brown skin, beige blazer, and a blurred background. I wanted to thank Lindsay, Jasper, Amanda, Jennifer, and the entire SCAG team for this invitation to present to you all during Toolbox Tuesday. I have to say I have a particular affinity for urban and regional planners because I was raised by one. So when this invitation came along, I thought, of course, I need to talk to colleagues, former colleagues of my own parents, urban and regional planners, because I have so much respect for the work that you do. I truly believe that the innovation with respect to language access happens on the state and local, on the same local side. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit about what you're doing during the Q&A session. I'm zooming in from Washington, D.C. I work at the Federal Coordination and Compliance section of the Civil Rights Division. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Civil Rights Division, usually with offices with much more understandable names: housing, immigrant and employment rights, employment. But then there's us, the Federal Coordination and Compliance section. So this afternoon, I wanted to preview a little bit about what we do here at the Federal Coordination and Compliance section and talk about the work and how I think it might be helpful to you during your work as creating a language access plan or thinking about creating and implementing a language plan. And so here's a preview of what we'll be talking about today. First, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with my office, I'll walk you through the federal requirements of language access. And I want to thank Daniel for that very thorough overview. He was able to save me a couple of points, so that was really helpful. Then I'll talk a little bit about what my office does. Then I'll move very quickly through the essential elements of a language access plan. I'd like to close by taking a quick tour of lep.gov. So let's talk a little bit about history. Daniel walked us through a lot of history, and I love this photo. It is a photo from the March on Washington, which happened 61 years ago. And the one sign that I think ties us to the work that we're doing this afternoon is "No U.S. Dough to Help Jim Crow Grow." And so why were folks holding up this placard during the March on Washington? Well, they wanted to make sure that federal funds aren't used in a discriminatory way. And that's really the basis of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The essential premise is to receive money or other assistance from the federal government, an entity has to agree to certain conditions, which means the money comes with strings. The origin of this requirement is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That law has a part called Title VI that says that any entity that gets federal money, and most state and local federal agencies do get substantial federal funding, they can't discriminate on the basis of race, color, and national origin. Our section of the Department of Justice works with entities who get DOJ funds to ensure compliance with Title VI. So let's take a minute to read the law that is the basis for national origin protections, Title VI, and how it applies to limited English proficient individuals. It says that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. I think the one thing I would highlight here is that it says no person. It doesn't say that you have to be a citizen of the United States. It really applies the requirement of language access to all who reside in the United States. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 requires recipients to provide meaningful access to their programs to people who are limited English proficient. National origin and language are closely related, and under Title VI, failing to make certain programs and activities accessible to individuals with LEP may amount to national origin discrimination. People should have meaningful access to such programs and activities. And we'll talk a little bit about what meaningful access looks like in practice later on. Now that I've given you the very abbreviated version of Title VI and its relationship to language access, I wanted to put our enforcement of Title VI into a larger context. Just like the Department of Justice, each federal agency is responsible for ensuring non-discrimination in the programs it funds. This is why every federal agency has a civil rights office that is charged with conducting compliance reviews and complaint investigations of its recipients. And of course, recipients receive funds from different agencies. This is why we have diagonal rows here. This, of course, could lead to inconsistency and confusion regarding what non-discrimination laws mandate and how to apply Title VI. And so this is where my office, the Federal Coordination and Compliance section, comes in. We're tasked with ensuring consistent and effective enforcement of Title VI and related funding statutes across the government. We help agencies speak with one voice, which in turn helps ensure that recipients receive consistent and clear direction, no matter which federal agency provides them with financial assistance. This means that we're often relied upon by federal and even state agencies for technical assistance and support as recipients comply with Title VI. So I know many of you are in the process of drafting or implementing a language access plan. I think I saw that 15% of you are either thinking about working on a plan or you're in the beginning steps. So let's take a step back now and talk about what goes into a language access plan. So the best way to think about a language access plan, or I'm going to use an acronym because I'm from DC, or a LAP, is think about it as an administrative blueprint to ensure an entity's compliance with language access requirements. So here are a few essential questions we ask to ensure that a language access plan is comprehensive. And by no means are the 6 boxes the end all and be all. In fact, I will drop in the chat link to our assessment and planning tool, which has a much more comprehensive assessment to ask yourself, how do I make sure my language access plan is thorough enough? But here are some big categories from my perspective. And I'm actually working from right to left. How do you identify LEP persons? That's really important because identifying whether or not someone is LEP is one of the first steps to providing them with language assistance services. Thinking about how you want to monitor and update your plan, timeframes, objectives, benchmarks. I've seen a lot of plans that are quite aspirational, but there are no timeframes or benchmarks, and it's very difficult to implement unless you have those deadlines in place. Does it talk about funding and procurement? Staff training is essential. I say whenever there is staff who have any possibility of public-facing interaction, it's really important that those staff are trained on your language access plan, policies, and procedures. How will you inform the community? How will they know that you have these language assistance services available? And are you informing them in their language, where they are at? And then finally, who will implement? I really like to put who will implement because it's all about accountability. I really think that plans are only good as they are implemented and as good as the staff behind them. So first of all, I want to say thank you to whoever is working on a language access plan, because I know that it can be a thankless job, and it's a big job to ensure that all people, regardless of the language that they speak, can access public services. And then finally, I wanted to walk through lep.gov. Let's see if I can get there. For those of you who are not familiar, lep.gov is maintained by my office. And I think this is a fantastic resource if you're just new to the topic of language access. And feel free to follow along on your own separate browser. You can listen to me, but I think it's okay if you want to just browse on lep.gov. But I wanted to show you 3 things that I think are of particular interest to you as you think about creating a language access plan, implementing a language access plan. As I mentioned, it can feel very lonely. It can feel that as if there are no templates available. And I just wanted to show you a couple of things on lep.gov that might make your work life a little easier. First, many of you just starting out may think, well, I don't even know whether or not there are individuals with LEP in my area. So that's where data comes in. And I know this is old data, 2015, it's almost 10 years old. We are working on updating it, but I also think you can go on to the census and specifically the American Community Survey. We could talk about those resources afterwards, but I think this is like really a quick and easy way to find out whether or not there are limited English proficient individuals in your area. So let's go to California, and we can actually zoom in. And the further we zoom in, we get information on the concentration and number of limited English proficient individuals in a particular county. So I'm just gonna, let's try, Los Angeles. I feel like everyone gives attention to Los Angeles. So let's choose a county a little bit. Let's try Orange County. Let's see. Ooh. Okay. Oh, it's not working for me today. But usually when you hit Orange County, it'll draw up for you both the number and percentage, as well as the different language groups spoken in Orange County. Here's some information. It'll give you we could switch to table mode. Here we are. We can look at the languages spoken within Orange County, so you have a better sense of who's in your neighborhood and what languages you need to translate your vital documents into. Okay, the other important place that I like to show people are templates. I get a lot of questions about, what about sample language access plans? I think it's very difficult to say that there's a sample language access plan because every agency is different, every demographic is different. However, there are language access plans. In fact, the federal government itself recently updated their own language access plans. And I think this is a great resource to borrow definitions, to borrow here, and actually let's pull up the Department of Justice's language access plan. You know, I think this is a great place so you don't feel like you have to start from scratch. There's a policy statement, purpose, scope, procurement, staff training. Now, these are all things that you could borrow within your own agency and adapt accordingly. And then the final thing I wanted to show you on lep.gov, because digital resources it's really the way that we reach communities now. I really like to show people what the expectation is with respect to access to digital services. How to create multilingual content, the perspective of whether or not to use automatic or machine translation, often known as Google Translate or other automatic translations, requirements for agencies. I think these are all great resources. And for those of you who are familiar with lep.gov, I'd love to hear in the chat what you like and what are the resources that you find valuable in your work. And with that, I will stop sharing and pass it on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laureen. Next, we have Anna. Are you ready to present, Anna?
Yes, I am just doing the obligatory pause to get my screen share. So hopefully that's working. Hello, good afternoon. Very happy to be here. My name is Anna Vallianatos. I'm the manager of Media and Public Affairs at SCAG. So, before I get into the presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about my background, which is communication and marketing. So I see this work very much from that lens. We've had, you've heard great information on the history, regulation, requirements, and all of that is really important. I'm an expert in something different, which is communication. I've worked in media relations, I've worked in public outreach, and also in marketing. And so, I take that approach in reaching LEP groups. So, quick overview of what I'll be talking about. Talk about language assistance plans, but also public participation plans, which is another guiding document that is important in guiding this work. Really works hand in hand with your language assistance plan. Laureen talked about Title VI. Both of those documents are requirements of the Title VI program. So any agency receiving federal funding, those two documents are part of the program, and they really work hand in hand when you're doing in language outreach and communication. And then I'll get into designing meaningful engagement based on these two documents. So first, the language assistance. So as I mentioned, this document is part of your Title VI program. And it specifies what you commit to translating. And it does that by defining vital documents and outlining which languages you'll translate them to. And something that I think is really important part of the guidance for language assistance plans is that the translation commitments should be reasonable given your available resources. And I'll get into why I think that it's important. So next is the public participation plan. And this document is also part of your Title VI program. But how it differs is that it outlines your overall approach to how you engage with the public. So the public participation plan is broader than just translation, but it really goes hand in hand with your language assistance plan because it covers much of how you will actually reach these in-language audiences after you've provided translation. And the intent of this document is to show how affected communities will have input on project decision-making. And I believe sometimes these are called community participation plans. So that's a term you may have seen as well. So you can, back to the intent of the public participation plan, providing affected communities the ability to have input on project decision-making. You really do that by designing meaningful engagement. So what are some things that you can do to set yourself up to have meaningful interactions with the public? In outreach, we always say to meet people where they are. And so you can think about this literally, as in going to the locations where these audiences can be found. But I also really like to think about it in terms of the information as well. Daniel talked about literacy, is a really important concept in thinking about all of this. And so if you know that you're trying to reach a community that is not, highly trained in some of these technical concepts, then you know that you need to meet them where they are in terms of providing simpler language without jargon. And if you have a limited English proficiency audience, you'll need to have translations and interpreters. I also like to think about reducing barriers when designing input opportunities. And there can be many barriers. We talked about non-accessible language, both for English and non-English speakers, but there's also time and place. And if the way that someone can learn about the project requires that they come in person, to a specific time and place, then that can be a barrier. But the great thing now is that with technology, we have so many more options for how we can make information available and how we can get feedback without having to require people to come to a specific time and place. It's also important to be sincere when gathering input. If there are specific decisions that you're looking for input on, then prompt that in your outreach questions and materials. Of course, commenters can always give you whatever information they want to share, but if they know what decisions they can potentially influence, that's really helpful in encouraging the engagement. I also like to specifically ask about the different trade-offs involved with a project, because it's a way to get at some of the values in a community that can be related to the decisions that need to be made. So keeping that in mind, I wanted to share a few things that I've learned working on public participation plans that I think can help set you up for meaningful outreach. Something I think is important is to allow your plan to be flexible enough to adapt to different efforts. So not all projects are the same. The project might be different. The community that it could affect will likely be different. And so if you have a one-size-fits-all approach in your plan, it's not going to fit every effort. So I really like to have the flexibility to tailor efforts to a specific community in the specific project that's being engaged on. Also, when you're putting together a document like this, it can be really, it can be really tempting to commit to doing a whole lot. And potentially overextend. So having clear objectives about who you're trying to reach and for what purpose is really important, because this can help you to focus your engagement to be meaningful. Often what I've seen, simply designed efforts can be really effective. It doesn't need to be really fancy and really involved. Getting out there on the ground and talking to people with some visual aids can be impactful. So as far as language assistance plans, I also have some thoughts that I'll share. In developing Title VI plan requires you to have some insight into who are the in-language populations. And Laureen talked about some tools that you can use to find that information. But this is then a great insight for designing your engagement. Because you can see where they are, what languages, and potentially cross-referencing with other demographic information. You can learn more about these communities to then generate insights on how to meaningfully connect with them. So translation alone isn't enough to reach these groups. You'll need to also have tactics that get the translated information into the hands of the communities. And this is where my earlier note about the reasonable use of resources comes in, because if you use all your resources translating that information, you will have fewer resources to get that information out. And so it's really important to balance that and plan that so that you have resources for both. So consider outreach holistically when you commit to how much you'll proactively translate. And again, simple, well-targeted efforts can be really effective. You don't necessarily need to be doing a lot of different tactics in order to do the engagement well. I also think monitoring is really key because it allows you to hone your resources. And for in-language efforts, thinking about, do you need, a dozen different types of materials, or can you have a few things that you do really well? How many in-language folks are turning out to, or are you reaching? Because that can then help you to right-size your efforts moving forward. For example, in LA County, languages other than Spanish are smaller parts of the population, but in certain areas, they are more significant parts of the population. So, for doing a countywide effort, we know that likely the engagement for some of those smaller groups will just be less because there's fewer people. But if we're going into a community where there is a bigger population of that language, we know we're going to need to have more resources available to accommodate that. So really thinking through who you're reaching, where, and monitoring that so that you can see those patterns and then right-size your efforts moving forward can also help you with the resources challenge. So that's what I have. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I hope this was helpful to all.
Thank you, Anna. All right, Lupita, are you ready to present?
Yes. Sorry, I
Looks
couldn't
good.
find the mute there for a second. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Lupita Huerta. I'm a transportation planner with the Department of Transportation in the city of Los Angeles. I have light brown skin, black hair, and I'm wearing glasses and headphones.
And I'm here excited to talk to you about the topic today. The prior speakers did an excellent job of delving into the importance of language access plans and how to implement them. And Anna just spoke about the connection of language access plans to engagement, which is what I'll be focusing on. Just a great connection there. I will specifically be sharing some of the ways we are implementing language access strategies as part of our engagement approach at the department. Briefly, what is our approach to engagement? I just wanted to provide an overview before we get into the rest of the conversation. So in 2020 and 2021, we began distilling our strategy and practices into what we refer to as our community first engagement framework. So this framework is defined as an approach that intentionally and holistically incorporates the viewpoints, lived experiences, and perspectives of the most impacted by a project or program. It aims to engage communities historically siloed from the planning process who require unique, customized, and culturally relevant approaches. So here are some of the core strategies that we use as part of this approach. Most relevant to our conversation today, however, are the first three. So we begin the engagement process by developing what we call a social climate analysis. Then that assesses the equity context and sets project benchmarks for engagement campaigns. This involves the use of data to assess the demographic profile of a community and to inform the engagement approach to be responsive and respectful to the community. This analysis helps inform the work that follows to reach community members who have been traditionally excluded by identifying language access needs, culturally relevant programming, and complementary services. The social climate analysis also informs our public participation plans, as Anna mentioned, or we also call them engagement plans, by helping us identify how we can reduce the barriers to participation. The analysis also helps inform the identification of potential community ambassadors, which is another strategy that we incorporate into our engagement. And that's what I'll be talking about today, along with our bilingual glossary that has been a great tool in an effort to reduce the barrier of participation for Spanish-speaking members of the community. So first off, community ambassadors. We have begun to work with ambassadors as part of our project engagement campaigns, and they've been integral in helping us reach community members where they are. So what are they? They typically reside and have long-term relationships with other community members and groups. Community members often feel more comfortable receiving information from a fellow community member rather than a public official. And ambassadors also help to inform engagement methods based on their local knowledge and perspective on what will be effective within their own community. We compensate ambassadors for their time as they're providing their local expertise and often are connecting with community members in their preferred language other than English. So we have some of our ambassadors pictured there. As I believe Anna mentioned, there's some ways that we can go beyond interpretation and translation. And in this way, community ambassadors have been key in helping us reach hard-to-reach community members. Translation and interpretation can be a starting point. In addition to providing documents and meetings in a language other than English, we have found via working with ambassadors that there are other language considerations that we should be thinking about. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our Hollywood Boulevard Safety and Mobility Project. So it's a case study of working with ambassadors and understanding not only in what language to communicate with folks, but also how. So based on our social climate analysis, we found that Spanish is the predominant language spoken at home outside of English. But we also found via Census American Community Survey data that of the percentage of the population in the project area who speak English less than very well, a substantial portion of residents spoke what it was classified as other Indo-European language and other Asian Pacific Islander language. Based on the community profile from the analysis, we ascertained that the predominant languages for those categories were Armenian and Thai, respectively. So those language didn't meet certain thresholds, but based on the makeup of the community, the project area specifically includes Thai Town and Little Armenia, for example, we determined that it was important to carry out outreach in these languages. So in addition to providing written translations and interpreters for meetings, we partnered with members of the Thai Community Development Center to connect with Thai and Armenian speakers. Not only did our ambassadors support us with speaking to monolingual folks in the community, including business owners, they also shared some insight into how community members receive information and how they like to communicate. One of our ambassadors shared, for example, that Thai elders may not respond to surveys or information directly in their language, but they have their children fill out forms, and they typically do that in English. So we may not receive a high number of responses in Thai to community surveys, for example, but having the information available in Thai was helpful for them to review. They also mentioned that they send out information to community members via WhatsApp, which is their preferred communication channel. Which is a channel that we don't really use as a department currently. So this was vital information that we would not have been aware of had we not connected with our ambassadors, and had they not helped us realize that we can go beyond translation and interpretation. So I wanted to just share an example of a resource that we developed for the project. This is a street graphic that denotes the different parts of the street. We created it in English and Spanish, as you can see here. And we also developed it in Armenian and Thai. I will note that we did a lot of this work via contract that allowed us to expand our capacity. So I understand that translating and having documents in multiple language like this may not be possible for our projects, but we hope to continue to do so as resources and capacity allows, and to continue to partner with community ambassadors to help us go beyond. Great. So next, I wanted to talk about our bilingual glossary. We launched the glossary in 2023, and it's a tool designed to help limit the barrier to participation for Spanish-speaking members of the community. As planners, we know that there are a lot of terms that may be difficult to explain in English, let alone in another language. So this tool really helps us to create a reference for folks who are joining a community meeting, for example, or receive a fact sheet from our department where there may be a term they may be unfamiliar with. The glossary includes both transportation terms and engagement terms that we use regularly as part of our work. So I wanted to provide just a little background on how it was developed. We had some initial staff development and review spearheaded by past members of our team, Jose Richard Aviles and Alex Friedman. After an internal staff development and review, we partnered with community members to review the initial list of terms and develop a more comprehensive list. We partnered with local CBO, LA Walks, who put out a call for participants to their network. Specifically, we were able to work with some of LA Walks' Safe Street Promotoras, who are local ambassadors to their community on all things related to safe streets and advocating for pedestrian and bicycle safety. As part of this work, we were able to compensate community members for their time, which included reviewing the document itself, but also included some focus groups held by our staff. We also worked with transportation planning practitioners who volunteered their time to help develop and review the glossary as well. Community member input was instrumental in understanding what transportation terms are highly used as part of the work, and what terms we need to make accessible to community members. Additionally, participants from LA Walks also noted the importance of including images as part of the glossary, which is something that we then incorporated. So after the initial review and discussion with community members, our staff went back to develop a more finalized first draft. And then that was reviewed by LA Walks one more time before we launched. So I did want to mention that building the glossary required consensus, not only based on which terms we included, but also what the proper translation was. So country of origin is really important when building language access tools, as there are regional differences that may come into play. So I wanted to share this graphic from the Pew Research Center that outlines the country of origin for Latino populations in the US. As it notes, populations are more diverse in the Northeast metro areas where we see a variety of countries of origin. If we look here at the bottom, it's the LA, Long Beach, Anaheim area, we see that the predominant country of origin is Mexico, along with El Salvador and Guatemala. And so community members and practitioners represented these countries of origin. So thus the glossary translations predominantly represent these regions. So I wanted to just note that, though we also include alternative terms. I wanted to just shout out our LA Walks folks, our partners. This is them with the final glossary. They use this as a tool in their own work and have it available for community members in their office as well. And this is a sample of the glossary, which I can link as well. As you can see, there's an overall category with different sections. So for this one, it's safe streets for people walking and biking. The terms that follow that section are all part of that same theme. So here the example is sidewalk or acera, and we have a definition and include alternatives, which can also be used. And in this case, we include banqueta as an alternative. So I encourage you to explore it if you haven't already. And I just wanted to also note how we use it. So at the department, our staff use the glossary as part of their work. When we translate documents internally, for example, we use the glossary as a reference to ensure that there is consistency. We also share it with community members during meetings and events. And I wanted to call out a key way we also use the glossary, which is by sharing it with interpreters. As mentioned previously, transportation terms are very technical and can be difficult to interpret on the fly. So we aim to provide this to interpreters prior to meetings so that they understand the terminology a bit more. So next steps on the glossary, we are collecting feedback on our first edition, and we plan to expand to other languages, hopefully soon. So stay tuned on that. But with that, I want to thank you all, and I'll hand it back over to Jasper or Lindsay.
Thank you so much. All right, now we're going to share our screen back to our SCAG slides.
Sorry about that same thing as everyone. Give me 1 second.
No worries. Well, thank you guys for sharing your amazing work. Now we're going into our Q&A panel, part of our presentation. So the first question is for Laureen. What about bilingual staff members? How, if at all, can agencies rely upon them to provide language assistance services?
Thank you, Jasper. I think this is such a critical part of language access plans. I think a lot of agencies have relied historically on bilingual staff members without really writing down the policy. So I think it's so essential for agencies to stop and think about, well, who's delivering language assistance services in language on behalf of my agency? So I think it's important that we assess, recruit, and think about ways to retain bilingual staff members. With respect to the department and federal agencies and recipients of federal funds, we want to encourage that bilingual staff members are assessed preferably by a third party. This can, there is a cost, I have to say. I've seen private third-party assessments range in price between like $150 to $300 per person. But I think it's so important because without that, there's no real way of knowing if someone is translating a document properly. I also think it's really important to help bilingual employees. I think there's some bilingual employees that we rely upon who may not want to or may not feel comfortable doing work in language, and knowing their ability to speak, read, write, or understand in another language helps managers in particular decide, okay, well, this person is qualified enough to speak on behalf of our agency, but she can't write or she can't do translation. To me, this is all about making sure our communications in non-English languages are just as accurate and concise as they are in non-English languages. So I think it is an overlooked part of language access plans. I've reviewed hundreds of language access plans, and really that's one area where I really think that it's important to spend some time to think about, well, what are our policies with respect to how much we will let bilingual staff do and in what situations. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that answer. I just want to remind the audience that now would be a great time to paste any questions in the chat if you have any. But we'll move on to our next question, which is for Daniel and Anna. What are some ways to reach communities that primarily use oral languages and not written languages?
Hi, everyone. I could go first. I don't know. I'm like, because I see my name first, I'm like, I'll go for it. If anything, first, I just want to begin by like thinking about one of the phrases that was said earlier about like governmental jargon. And just because the governmental jargon is translated doesn't mean that the other person on the receiving end will understand it, right? So I think one of the main challenges or goals is making sure that whatever information we're making available for the public is able to be understood by them, right? So again, going back to meeting them at where they're at, right? And also understanding that not every language has a writing system, or, you know, some are just like verbal or oral. And when it comes to figuring out what's the best way to give them information or to even provide them with the resources that they need that is in writing, right? One of the ways that I was thinking about is providing it with QR codes and having them scan those QR codes, where then it would just like allow them to listen into what the letter, what the notice, or what the resources are available in that spoken language. So just like using new technologies and new resources that are currently being developed and using that to our advantage to make information more accessible to folks and to communities that don't have a writing system, or even just folks who aren't capable of reading, right?
Yeah, I would just second, you know, what Daniel's saying about meeting people where they are, right? And so, you know, I talked about understanding the audience that you're trying to reach, and, you know, understanding the particulars of some of these languages that we find in our diverse communities, then is really important, because that gives us insight into how best to reach them. So in the instance of a language that's not written, then we know we're not going to be able to reach them with writing. So, you know, Daniel's talking about some creative solutions around providing something that can be listened to. You know, taking people in person to have conversations is another great way to do that. But pictograms, I think, you know, is something else that I've used in campaigns that I've worked on with communities that have oral languages. And, you know, Lupita had a great image, the diagram of the street, you know, something like that with no text on it, that can be you know, looked at in a conversation, you know, around what's going on with that project, you know, could be another way to share information, you know, with a community that's not written language. So, you know, I think on this one, you really just have to think about what it is you're trying to communicate, who you're communicating it to, where are they, you know, and then design something that can be meaningful.
Thank
And I
you,
see that
guys.
Laureen, oh, I was gonna say, and I see that Laureen posted
Yeah,
in the
go
chat
ahead.
right there that some of the work, there's been also issues for audio press releases, and I think that's really amazing. I love that.
I was going to highlight that too. Thank you so much, Laureen, for pasting that in the chat. So if you guys are all done with that question, next question we have is for Lupita. What are the benefits and challenges to partnering with a community-based organization on language access and public engagement work more broadly?
Yeah, so I talked about some of the benefits in my presentation, right? CBOs are local to their community. Sometimes there are larger CBOs that cover, a lot of different neighborhoods, but then there are others too that are more hyper local. So depending on what what kind of project or work you're working on, you can partner with different organizations to reach folks that way. And they have the expertise of their community and how to reach people and where to meet people where they are. So there's, I think, endless benefits. I think the challenges are, a lot of the organizations are, very small, and more, departments or, other organizations are reaching out to the same CBOs for, help, which, in one way is great because people are making more of an effort to actually connect with people meaningfully. However, we have seen that a lot of CBOs are really stretched thin. So I think just something to keep in mind is, if you're connecting with a community-based organization, figure out what their capacity is. You can still keep them connected, maybe sharing information, for example. But yeah, I just want to make sure that I highlight that, not all CBOs have the same capacity. And another just kind of challenge in our work is we like to ensure that we're compensating community members for their time and their expertise. And, sometimes the contracting process is a little convoluted, or there's just challenges that, come along with that. So that's something else that came to mind with this question. Yeah.
Thank you. Laureen, I saw your hand up. Did you want to speak to that?
Very briefly, although Lupita touched on it, I just want to make sure you pay community-based organizations because they are stretched so thin. I also wanted to raise an ethical issue with respect to reliance on community-based organizations. In some cases, at least with respect to federal government, if they're doing it for free and you've asked them, could it be construed as a gift? And I know that both state and federal agencies may have issues with receiving gifts, but I would say treat community-based organizations as any other vendor. You want to make sure they're assessed, and you want to make sure you pay them well and treat them well, because community-based organizations reach individuals and communities who are LEP far better, certainly, than the federal government. So it's a great partnership to pursue.
Thanks so much. So we're going to go to the next slide, which has a lot more questions. But first, we're going to go back to some questions that we've gotten in the chat. So I believe this first question was directed towards Anna, but of course, if anyone has anything else to say on it, go ahead and jump in. So this question is, can you provide examples for monitoring or metrics of public participation and language access plans?
Yeah, so I think that's, I'm glad you asked, because I think it's something important, and I'm happy to share. So, some examples of things that I've tracked around this would be, number of calls. If you've got a call center that has interpretation available, are there reports of how many calls you're getting? If you're offering surveys or forms in multiple languages, how many are you receiving, and in what languages? If you've got in-person engagement happening, can you get general reports on the numbers of people who were engaging? Something else I did once was, in a large public hearing situation, we had handouts in multiple languages. I knew exactly how many I had, and then afterwards I counted, I had the team count how many were left so that we knew how many had been picked up in each of the languages. And so tracking those metrics over time, you can just be aware of what's being more effective to help hone your resources accordingly, because I know that the resource issue is is really a challenge on a lot of this. And so, you know, something that I've always thought was really important is just how to learn to become more effective at this over time. And so monitoring is just really key. So I hope that was helpful in kind of getting some thoughts going on what, you know, what kind of metrics might apply to whatever outreach you're doing.
Thank you. If no one else has anything to say about that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next question from the chat. So Isabel asked, do you have any strategies or best practices for requiring consultants to have adopted language access plans and translators on staff? This person has found that translating a consultant or tech team's project materials oftentimes falls on community-based organization partners, even when it's outside of their scope of work. Yeah, go ahead.
So this is interesting because I do wonder what the initial contract with a consultant looked like. I think it would be very difficult to rely on consultants to do translation unless it's already part of their contract. And I think it's often overlooked because we don't think about the end product and how we want to reach all of the communities. In terms of procurement and I would say the requirements, I think it's terrible that it's falling on CBOs. I think it often happens with community-based organizations because it's the community that often needs the services. So they're willing to do the translation or even do some interpretation just so that their community gets that information. But to me, this is like planning ahead. And so what I'm also going to do is I'm going to drop in the chat an ordering guide, a procurement ordering guide. It's largely for federal governments, but it has information on sort of like sample statements of work, sample definitions that you could include in those contracts before you hire the consultant to make clear that language access is part of their job as well.
I'll just add to for one of a past contract that we had, we included, and you know, we're trying to do that in the future for others, not for the consultant to do that directly, but for them to have like an on-call kind of service as part of their like direct costs. That way, you know, you can work with a company that specifically works on translation and interpretation. So that yes, it does not fall on CBOs because, as mentioned, that's just a lot to put on them. And it's one thing to like translate documents, it's another thing to interpret. Like live interpretation is really difficult. So we definitely don't want that to fall on, you know, either a consultant or a CBO who, you know, may not be an interpreter, you know, as a field. So yeah.
Yeah, I would just echo some of what Lupita and Laureen have talked about. You know, I've always had the translation services in a separate contract. You know, and I think it's best if there can be some flexibility to that so that you use it when you need it. Because there's also, you know, there's if you're doing engagement around a project, you know, there's obviously project-based needs there, but you know, in terms of information on request, complaints, you know, there may be other situations in which you may need translation services outside of proactive project outreach. And so, you know, in terms of planning ahead, it's useful to have a resource that you can call on for those types of needs as well.
Thank you, guys. So we are nearing the end of our session, so I want to try to briefly get through some of the questions that we have prepared. So our first question, if anyone wants to jump in, is just briefly describe what was the process of developing your language access strategy?
And I think too, we have a lot of questions on screen. So I think if any of our speakers are particularly interested in any of the questions we have up there, or if anybody in the audience wants us to make sure that we address one of the questions on the screen, maybe we could prioritize our time that way.
Hi, I'm gonna try to answer that question the best that I possibly can. If anything, the language access strategy here at HCD was developed before I arrived here, so I've only been here for a little over a year now. But if anything, what I am doing is I'm meeting with each division within the department. And with that, understanding the unique issues or obstacles that each division has to figure out how to update the language access plan that we currently have, because each division operates uniquely when it comes to working with the general public or members of the public. And right now we are in a survey year, meaning that we are tallying up and collecting data with each communication that we do have with the public, and using that as a way to figure out how many bilingual staff do we need, if there are any positions within HCD that we need to convert into bilingual positions, and if there's any other languages other than Spanish, because currently we only certify in Spanish. If there are any other languages that we do have that we could try to convert into other certification requirements or to meet those requirements. So if anything, right now, what we're doing is just trying to figure out how to resolve, or at least to remove any of the barriers when it comes to each division's obstacles with language access. So, but yeah.
Thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, so like Lindsay said, since I don't think we'll have time to go through like all of the questions, if there's a specific question that you guys want to choose, or like a few questions that you think you have a good answer for, you can just go ahead and jump in with the answer and let us know which question you're answering.
Jasper, I can speak to questions 3, 2, and 5 a little bit. I mentioned resources, and I think that is a common challenge that I'm very aware of around this kind of work. And I know it can, especially for smaller jurisdictions. I imagine that's a big challenge. And so, I talked in my presentation a little bit about just really focusing, and I think that is the advice that I would give to agencies in thinking through their strategies. I think very good intentions. We want to do a lot. We want to do the best we can and reach everyone. However, the reality is we're not going to have the resources to do that. So how do we really focus the strategies to be impactful and reach the folks that we need to reach? And some of how you can do that is in in procurements. I am a big fan of bundling work, when you can combine things together. You have similar projects, you make that one procurement. That reduces the resources, the staff resource that you need to put into procuring that. I talked about an ongoing contract for translation that you can use to enhance other efforts. That's another way that you can scale a little bit in terms of the amount of procurement that you need to do. I mean, and I think there's other solutions. If you think about scale, that could be helpful here. Opportunities to partner with other groups that may be looking to do similar work. So again, pooling resources, to have a better quality of output. Just some thoughts that I have.
I want to highlight in the chat that Laureen is expressing that there's no need to work on this alone. And Laureen is pasting in the chat some great communities of practice and list serves that think and discuss language access planning all the time. So definitely go check those out. And if you let me know if there's any questions that you guys would like to answer, and I'll take a few moments, and then if not, we can just go ahead and wrap the session up.
Alrighty. Seems like we are good to go. People aren't chiming in with additional questions or answers. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you to our amazing speakers for sharing the amazing work that you're doing and educating us a little bit on how to follow in your footsteps. Thank you to all the participants. I hope you found this session helpful and useful. We'd like to invite you to take a brief 2-minute survey to help us improve future Toolbox Tuesdays. So that link I think is going to be popped in the chat and or will be sent out when the meeting ends. So with that, I just want to do a final thank you to Jennifer Martinez, Amanda McDaniel, Tom Vo, Jasper Dwyer, and all of the SCAG staff who helped put this together today. And yeah, hope you all have a safe and healthy day and week, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.